Good evening and welcome to the Orange County District Attorney Candidate Forum. My name is Jan Wagner. The League of Women Voters, the candidates, and I welcome you to the forum. The League of Women Voters is a trusted, nonpartisan political organization that has been active for 100 years. While we never endorse a candidate or party, we are directly involved in shaping the important issues to keep our community strong. As a League member, I have the opportunity to contribute in ways that have a great impact on local, state, and even national issues. If you are interested in learning about how you can make a similar impact, I encourage you to visit our League website at LWVnoc.org. Membership is open to men and to women. We are conducting this forum without any in-person audience. The good news is you are watching comfortably from home or on your television or computer, either as we broadcast live or as you watch the full recording later on YouTube at LWVoc. During the forum, chat will not be open and the audience will not be able to unmute themselves. But many of you have emailed questions to us in advance. As is often the case, we have received many more questions than we will probably be able or have time to answer, but we will do our very best. Questions have been combined to avoid duplication and have been screened to eliminate personal attacks or questions that do not pertain to the duties of the district attorney. Assisting us this evening is our timekeeper, Sue Guilford. Our candidates this evening for district attorney are Pete Hardin, Brian G. Hawk, and Michael Jacobs. Candidate Todd Spitzer is not joining us this evening. Our candidates drew lots for the order that they will give their opening statements, their closing statements, and receive questions. First to give his opening statement this evening is Pete Hardin. Mr. Hardin, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. My father was an Army veteran who later became a judge. My mother was a school teacher who raised me and my 3 siblings. And my parents instilled in me the values that guided them: integrity, courage, respect, and compassion. These are the values that guided me in my career as a Marine Corps officer and as a military, federal, and local prosecutor right here in Orange County. And these are the values that guide my campaign for district attorney, a campaign that presents a new vision and a new leadership for safety and quality of life in Orange County. We urgently need a new vision because our current DA isn't keeping us safe. Homicides are at a 22-year high. Armed robbery is up over 50%. Homelessness is up over 40%. You know, when I was a prosecutor, I saw people recycle through the system time and again for the same set of underlying issues: mental illness, addiction, homelessness. My approach and my vision for safety and justice is one in which we recognize those issues as the public health crises that they are, instead of simply criminalizing them time and again, somehow expecting a different result. My approach and my vision for safety and justice is one in which we seek accountability while recognizing that punishment alone does not produce more safety, but often increases recidivism and therefore creates more victims. We urgently need new leadership because our current DA is mired in lawsuits and scandals that cost us millions of dollars and erode public trust. I learned a lot about leadership, earning my commission as a Marine Corps officer and serving our nation for 8 years. I led the prosecution office for the largest command in the Corps, trained hundreds of Marines on the rules of engagement, and led Marines at war in Afghanistan. I've led trial teams of attorneys, law enforcement, and subject matter experts. I'm running for DA to bring justice with integrity, accountability, and transparency to an office in a county that desperately need it because we simply cannot afford another 4 years the way things have been going. For more information on my, thanks.
Go ahead, give your website.
Oh, sure. For more information, please check out PeteHarden.com, and I look forward to a great discussion. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Next to give his opening statement is Mr. Jacobs.
Okay, thank you for having me. my primary qualifications and what I would like to talk about is my career in the district attorney's office. And it's going to become very apparent to everybody here that all of the candidates have come from a varied background and have a varied number of qualifications. While I was in the district attorney office, I served almost 30 years there. After my initial time on the felony panel, year and a half, I spent the next 21 out of 25 years in vertical trial units. Those units were the career criminal, sexual assault, narcotics, special assignments, and homicide. I spent 13 years in the DA's homicide unit. I supervised the felony trial division for 3.5 years, and I supervised homicide for 3 years. My overall statistics in the district attorney's office comprised over 140 jury trials, 75 felony trials, 26 homicides, and 7 capital cases. A comparison, and I don't mean in any way to demean my opponents, none of my opponents, including Mr. Spitzer, have spent 1 day in a vertical trial unit or supervised a unit for a single day. What has been the result of this lack of experience on the part of Mr. Spitzer? Well, major cases, too many for me to go over in this opening, including a serial rape case and a potential homicide case, have been undermined and compromised by him. 16 lawsuits have been filed against Mr. Spitzer in the county. 14 of the civil cases involved enabling sexual harassment of females. 2 cases are for wrongful termination of investigators. Approximately during his 3.5 years as district attorney, approximately 100 attorneys out of staff of 300 have quit, retired, or been fired. I think this could be termed chaos, total absolute chaos, to put it mildly, and a total absence of leadership.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you.
Mr. Chihawk.
Thank you for being here tonight. A little bit about myself. I was born in Southern California and moved from Big Bear to Orange County when I was 4 years old. I went to public elementary, middle, and high school in San Clemente and graduated from the University of California at San Diego. As for the district attorney's office, I believe it should be apolitical and committed to the fair, equal, and transparent administration of justice. We need a district attorney that is unconnected to the issues of the past and the present, as well as someone who will provide independent and unbiased leadership while helping restore public confidence in the office. I am so committed to the independence of the district attorney's office that I am foregoing campaign contributions from any source. Ultimately, however, the district attorney position is about trust. Who do you trust with the tremendous discretion afforded prosecutors? When answering these type of questions, a candidate's prior experience and performance matters. As for myself, I graduated law school in the top 10% of my class, clerked for 2 United States Court of Appeals judges, was in private practice in Los Angeles, and have been with the US Department of Justice since 2006. While with the Justice Department, I received 2 Assistant Attorney General Awards for Excellence and 2 for Distinguished Service. In 2015, I received an Attorney General Award, one of the highest honors the department bestows, for my work in a criminal terrorism prosecution out of Portland. In 2016, I transferred to the Southern District of California to serve as counsel for the US Drug Enforcement Administration. As counsel, I work with special agents, federal and state task force officers, and others to prosecute drug cartel members, doctors and pharmacies that divert controlled substances, gang leaders, and fentanyl dealers. In 2020 and 2022, I received awards for excellence for my work in a controlled substance litigation and a particularly complex criminal prosecution. I've undergone numerous background investigations, including being polygraphed. I look forward to answering your questions and hopefully earning your vote. Thank you.
Thank you. In accordance with our guidelines, Todd Spitzer was allowed to submit an opening statement, and he has done so, and I will read it now, although I have modified one paragraph which we deemed inappropriate for the opening statement. According to the California Department of Justice, Orange County is the safest major county in California and is home to 5 of the top 10 safest cities in the state. Meanwhile, once beautiful places like Los Angeles and San Francisco have deteriorated beyond recognition. This is not a coincidence. The district attorneys in those places are refusing to do their job and prosecute crime. But here in Orange County, public safety is and always will be my top priority. As your district attorney, I'm proud to report that I aggressively prosecute violent criminals, theft, and hate crimes, and stand by members of law enforcement to ensure your community is safe. I also recognize that we cannot simply handcuff our way out of the crime problem. That is why I've invested in early intervention, job training, and programs to address mental illness and addiction. I'm proud that I helped open the county's first homeless shelter and humanely cleared the Santa Ana riverbed. The main difference between me and pro-criminal district attorneys like George Gascon is that I believe we can have common sense reform that does not come at the expense of public safety or innocent victims. Since being elected in 2018, I have worked to promote a transparent and accountable criminal justice system and restore integrity to the Orange County District Attorney's Office. I fired unethical prosecutors, held bad cops accountable, closed the door on my predecessor's snitch scandal once and for all, and overturned ill-gotten convictions as a result. At the same time, I've prosecuted violent criminals, haters, skinheads, rapists, and child molesters with the full force of the law. It is for these reasons that my re-election has been endorsed by Republicans and Democrats alike, including all the employee groups who work for me, labor unions, business groups, law enforcement, veterans, crimes victims organizations, and the Orange County Register. I'm asking for your vote and support so we can continue to keep Orange County safe. Now let's move on to the questions that have been submitted. Each candidate will have 1 minute to respond to each question. Questions will be asked in the same order as the opening statements, beginning with the second candidate. So our first question will go to Mr. Jacobs. Mr. Jacobs, please describe your experience as a prosecutor versus a politician.
Okay, I kind of covered some of that in my opening statement. Most of my career, my legal career was spent in the Orange County District Attorney's Office. And as I mentioned, I spent 23 and a half years in trial units there. While I was supervising the Homicide Division, I also created an unsolved homicide project called Trackers, which was an innovative new approach or task force approach to solving unsolved cases. I also, because we found an innocent man who'd been convicted of a homicide, I also founded the Orange County Innocence Project, which was a way by which the state prisons could be canvassed for any inmates who thought that they had been wrongfully convicted. And I guess that sums up my career.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cheehawk, would you like me to repeat the question?
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, so I've been an attorney for 25 years, 23 years with the federal government. I have never been a politician. This is the first office that I've ever run for. While with the Department of Justice, I've served as a deciding official for the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility. I've worked in DOJ's National Security Section, where I represented the federal government before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. I have, like I said, been with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration since 2016, where we work to prosecute drug cartel members, doctors and pharmacies that divert controlled substances, gang members, fentanyl dealers, and a whole wide variety of criminals and drug dealers. I don't really have much experience in the political world, and unfortunately, sometimes that shows. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Harden.
Thank you. I've never been a politician. I've been a Marine and I've been a prosecutor at every level of our justice system. I think it's one thing to take the right positions. It's another to be able to implement them in a massive office like what we have here in Orange County. I have the leadership and legal experience to manage this office and implement the changes we need. You know, to be a Marine Corps officer is to be a student of leadership. And I have tried to carry that study forward throughout my post-military career. I define myself as a democratic or participative servant leader. And that means I live by a people first mindset. I involve team members intimately in decision-making because when team members feel included and engaged, they're more motivated to follow a leader's final word decision and contribute.
Thank you. Our next question goes first to Mr. Cheehawk. Mr. Chihawk, define implicit bias and how you would ensure that your staff is continually aware of it.
So implicit bias is basically a standard in which individuals don't have shared experiences. And so at the end of the day, they believe certain things about individuals in certain classes, sexes, genders, whatever the particular group is. It is a very difficult thing to train or to educate against, because by its definition, it is inherent in somebody's sort of makeup. And I think the best way to combat that type of discrimination is really to diversify both the district attorney's office and the entire justice system. You really need shared experiences and a shared group of individuals that sort of can provide that sort of comprehensive approach to a community.
Thank you. Mr. Harden.
Thank you. I think of implicit bias as actions that people take on the basis of prejudice and stereotypes without meaning to do so. Prejudice and stereotypes that we may not even know that we have. We absolutely have to work to combat this. One way we can do that is with blind charging. That is charging cases with prosecutors not having information about the racial breakdown of the people involved. Another way, as Brian mentioned, and I am in total agreement, is to diversify the office and law enforcement to make sure that they represent this incredibly diverse county that we live in.
Thank you. Mr. Jacobs.
I think in team concepts when it comes to implicit bias, and in the district attorney's office, you work in compartmentalized and specific units. And I think implicit bias arises sometimes when there isn't diversity of the group, but more often than not, I think it's from lack of communication within the group. And I think their leadership comes to be very important, especially the assistant position or head of the specific units. I think when evaluating cases and working together, I think that it needs to be understood that the application of the law has to be fair and it has to be impartial. And if certain biases surface, then they should be dealt with to make sure that the application of the law and the way we're applying it is fair and equal. And I think it's a work in progress, and it's something that team leaders and people assigned to these very important units need to work on to make sure that we eliminate implicit bias.
Thank you. Our next question goes first to Mr. Harden. Mr. Harden, Proposition 57, which was approved in November of 2016, allows parole consideration for nonviolent felons, changes policies on juvenile prosecution, and authorizes sentence credits for rehabilitation, good behavior, and education. What do you think of this law?
I'm a tremendous supporter, Jan. I think that's a great question. California is moving in the right direction. In 1980, we had 24,000 people in state prisons. By 2006, we had 174,000. There is no question that we are grossly over-incarcerated in this state and this country, and that the disparities within that population are terrible. And measures like Prop 57 move us in the right direction.
Thank you. Mr. Jacobs.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. Proposition 57, which was approved in November 2016, allows parole consideration for nonviolent felons, changes policies on juvenile prosecution, and authorizes sentence credits for rehabilitation, good behavior, and education. What do you think of this law?
I really question its application. And I think when we start, these kind of laws start moving us towards a progressive or equity-based kind of system of justice. The problem with all of these is they basically take away the discretion of the district attorney. And my experience has been when that happens, sentences get lighter and more prisoners get early released. So there's three parts here. There's early parole. I have a problem with that because I believe what it means is prisoners won't have to serve the time on their enhancements, that the enhancements won't necessarily be served if they're otherwise eligible parole. As far as juvenile, that's the one that I really don't have too much problem with. It gives the judges a chance to make the final determination as to whether or not the juvenile should be tried as to adult. As far as sentencing credits, that's a problem too. I think we have a problem here where you have rising crime and progressive legislation, and you're going to keep having rising crime if you keep having an open door policy and keep reducing sentences. So I tend to oppose Prop 57.
Thank you. Mr. Chihawk.
Yeah, I would be in favor of Prop 57 and other measures like it. At the end of the day, everybody is for a smarter criminal justice system. People have different approaches on how to get there. I personally believe that sort of the diversification of responsibility within the justice system is a good thing, right? So the idea that a prosecutor no longer has sole discretion on whether or not to charge a juvenile as adult makes sense to me, right? You want a check against sort of unbridled power. You want, and at the end of the day, the most important thing about these pieces of legislation or propositions is to treat individual cases differently, right? So you want to make sure that a prisoner has some incentive to serve his or her sentence in a meaningful and productive manner, right? Just sticking somebody in jail for 10 years and saying it's 10 years no matter what doesn't do any good for that individual. You want that person to come out with some skill set and some hope to live a different life.
Thank you. Our next question goes first to Mr. Jacobs. Mr. Jacobs, the California Supreme Court has eliminated cash bail for defendants who can't afford it, writing that conditioning freedom solely, this is a quote, conditioning freedom solely on whether an arrestee can afford bail is unconstitutional, end quote. Do you agree with this ruling?
No, I don't. I think the problem, again, without cash bail, you're going to have an open door and a rotating door, and you're going to have people going in. I think part of the lack of cash bail is the effect you can see by looking at the videos of what's happened in New York City, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. And no, I'm against eliminating cash bail.
Thank you. Mr. Chihawk.
Yes, with a qualification. I think at the end of the day, there's only two criteria that should determine whether or not somebody stays in jail: the seriousness of their crime and their sort of threat to society. If that doesn't exist, that person should not spend time behind bars. The difficulty with a no cash bail system is we haven't properly funded the justice system, including the public defender's office, to satisfy the constitutional requirements of speedy trial. You can't have people stuck in jail forever awaiting trial, right? And so the current framework of cash bail only rewards those who can pay the bail, right? We need to get to a system that addresses the fundamental questions of who needs to stay in jail while they await trial and who doesn't. So if there's a risk to flee or there's a serious threat to the community, that person should stay in jail whether or not they have $1 million or $10. If they don't represent any of those two problems, we should let them out.
Thank you. Mr. Hardin.
Cash bail was never about public safety. Let's be very clear about that. We have got to do better than a system by which a dangerous, wealthy person can buy his way out of pretrial detention, whereas a less affluent person languishes behind bars. And in the Humphrey decision, the Supreme Court cited studies that demonstrate clearly that when that happens, people are more likely to end up unemployed, homeless, and lose custody of children. That's punishing poverty. I'll follow state law that tells us that we cannot condition pretrial release solely based on ability to pay. I think in the Humphrey decision, I think the quote was that liberty is the norm, and detention before trial is to be the carefully limited exception. And I certainly believe in that. And I'll work with the experts to find ways to reduce the use of money bail in a safe way and work to go to a safe risk-based system instead.
Thank you. Our next question goes first to Mr. Chihawk. Mr. Chihawk, how big a role does the district attorney play in the homeless crisis? What can the district attorney do to clean up our streets and help those who need it?
Yeah. Look, at the end of the day, solutions to homelessness, poverty, drug addiction, mental illness do not reside within the district attorney's office or the Justice Department as a whole. What we need to do as a justice system, and particularly the DA's office, is not exacerbate the problem, right? As Pete sort of mentioned earlier, we can't have this revolving door policy where we just take those individuals with mental illness and cycle them through the justice system. Unfortunately, there is a lot of drug addiction associated with homelessness and mental health issues. We need to have a fundamental different approach to how we treat this problem in this country, right? It's going to require significant investment, both of time and money. So for example, we need to change laws that deal with civil commitment, with conservatorship. We need to treat people who are unable to treat themselves with compassion and understanding, but we need to do so in a way that actually still presents solvable solutions for a community.
Thank you. Mr. Hardin.
Thank you. I'm going to respectfully disagree with Brian on this and say that I think the district attorney plays a tremendous role here. For one thing, our current district attorney sits on the Orange County Commission for Homelessness and is a no-show. If you Google Todd Spitzer homelessness no-show, you'll see articles about it. Look, when someone's arrested, the DA wields a tremendous amount of power, unchecked power, deciding whether charges are brought and what penalties are sought. These types of decisions have far-reaching implications for safety and our quality of life. Look, 95% of the people we send to prison are going to come back and end up back on our streets. And the district attorney has a lot to say about what we do to help them transition back into society in a positive and productive way, not just because it's the right thing to do, but as a public safety matter.
Thank you. Mr. Jacobs.
I think, as Brian pointed out, there really is a limitation on what the district attorney can do. However, I know from recently, especially in the last few years, there have been new programs that have been diversion type programs for veterans, for people with drug problems, and also with mental health problems. The problem is, I think, one prescription doesn't fit everyone, and I think the programs you need to have at the initial stages, and the district attorney can do this, to look at the individual defendant to determine whether or not it would be beneficial, and if this is the type of inmate who actually would have the input and the drive to be successful. If you don't do that, if you don't do the screening, you'll just have an open door policy where they go to programs, fall out of the programs, and come back. So the idea is, I think, is trying to match the particular defendant to a program that will work. And the district attorney can do that. They can be capable of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next question goes first to Mr. Hardin. Do you have plans to ensure that our county can increase access to diversion programs and necessary resources like community-based mental health treatment as an alternative to incarceration? And can you give an example of a plan that you are developing?
Absolutely. As I mentioned in my opening, when I was a prosecutor, I saw people recycle through the system time and again for the same set of underlying reasons, one of which is mental illness. Another is addiction and homelessness. We have got to find ways to help people get out of the justice system, not just hit them over the head time and again with punishment, somehow expecting a different result every time. You can't treat COVID with a hammer, and you can't treat addiction or mental illness by throwing people in an 8x10 cell. I will double and triple down on the programs we have in place now, the diversion programs we have, the homeless courts, the veterans courts that we have in place now. And I'll work with groups across the country who are creating more programs to help people with mental illness get healthy and not walk around with the scarlet letter of a conviction on their backs for the rest of their lives, which only makes it harder to find employment and their next place to live.
Thank you. Mr. Jacobs.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, as I mentioned in my last answer, there are new programs that have just been initiated in Orange County courts. And one of course, which I think is getting the most publicity and most success, is the Veterans Court. However, what's needed now, I think, is more diversion programs for both mental illness and drug addiction. There used to be a very successful program referred to as drug court, but that's no longer successful because it usually dealt with suspect defendants who were charged with felony possession. Those cases now have become misdemeanors as a result of Prop 47, which basically means that the drug court is diluted. And there are very few people who apply and go through the program now. So I think the problem is you need new programs having to deal with drug addiction and mental illness in order to to divert some of these defendants so that they don't go just in and out of the system and in and out of custody. And it's a challenge. It's going to be a real challenge, whoever the district attorney is.
Thank you. Mr. Chihak.
Yes, so I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, we need diversion, alternative courts. There is a fundamental difference between sort of incarcerating somebody and giving them the treatment that they need, right? We need to recognize the difference between these type of defendants. My concern is at the end of the day, people with mental illness or serious drug addiction may very well be successful in those particular programs. There's not an overwhelming success rate. We need to do things for people in the society before they enter the justice system, right? Waiting until someone is arrested because they're addicted to meth and break into a 7-Eleven, we've already failed, right? So we need to fundamentally change how we're dealing with this problem. And quite frankly, not just put it on the justice system or the prison system or alternative courts. We need all of that, but we need so much more.
Thank you. Our next question goes first to Mr. Jacobs. What role should the Orange County District Attorney's Office have in protecting the rights of immigrants from translation services to charging practices?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Sure. What role should the Orange County District Attorney's Office have in protecting the rights of immigrants from translation services to charging practices?
Well, I think the problem that you have here is you have both you have a conflict between the federal immigration laws and the state sanctuary laws. I think, and so you, as a district attorney, there's a fine line you have to walk here. Santa Ana, for instance, is a sanctuary city, and the rules that apply in Santa Ana may be different than they are in the other courts. I think the main thing here, I think, is just you have to understand what those rules are. And the problem that I see, it hasn't been rectified, is that the sanctuary rules and those laws conflict directly with federal immigration laws. So I think all that you have to do is you really have to comply with both rules, which is very difficult.
Thank you. Mr. Chihak.
Yes, so with the caveat that my administration would always follow the law, the difficulty here is we need to distinguish between vulnerable populations, immigrants are certainly part of that population, and violent criminals, right? The justice system and the community is less safe when people don't feel comfortable engaging the justice system or the police. So someone here who's illegally, who is a victim of a crime, they need to be protected through the entire process, whether or not they're a witness or file a complaint, testify in court. That person needs to be protected from immigration consequences. The reverse is not true. Somebody who spends a 10-year sentence, at least in my view, spends a 10-year sentence for rape shouldn't deserve the same protections as the individual who made the complaint. And so we need to have a system that is smarter, that differentiates between victims of crimes and vulnerable populations and predators. Without that, you are immediately alienating half the population because they don't want those individuals in their community that are committing those violent crimes.
Thank you. Mr. Hardin.
The district attorney plays a tremendous role here in ensuring that all our communities in Orange County know that they have a voice in our criminal justice and law enforcement communities. I have worked tirelessly on my campaign to build bridges with those communities, and I'll continue to do so. We have got to make sure that when the people understand that when local law enforcement engage in immigration enforcement, we create distrust in those communities. That makes immigrant communities less likely to come forward and report crimes. And that makes us all less safe. We cannot have whole immigrant communities who are afraid to report crime or participate in investigations. That presents a danger to all of us. So where possible, I will avoid punishing people twice, once in the criminal justice system and then again in the immigration system. It won't always be possible, as Brian just noted, but district attorney plays a huge role here, and our current DA is falling flat on this.
Thank you. Our next question goes first to Mr. Chihawk. Can you name specific policies and/or instructions that you will take with your prosecutors to reduce or eliminate racial disparities in the Orange County criminal legal system?
Yeah, I touched on this a little bit before. I think the most important thing you can do in the office is diversify it, both in terms of who is a district attorney and what experience they bring. So we can't have a justice system that sort of treats everybody the same way. Pete mentioned earlier about sort of blind charges. That's a great start, right? It is also a small part of what makes the community safe, right? I would want the district attorney focusing and the police focus on proactive policing, right? Getting into organizations that are truly dangerous organizations, right? The fact that you can have a blind charge to the person who has a drug conviction or a drug arrest, that's a great start. But we need to do things that make the community safer in a smarter, more transparent way. And I think it's fundamentally about who is in the district attorney's office, as opposed to what 10 courses you can send your district attorneys through to be more racially and gender and every other vulnerable group protected or sensitive. Sorry.
Thank you. Mr. Hardin.
Sure. You asked for specific policies. As I mentioned earlier, I'll institute blind charging to reduce the propensity for implicit bias, which we chatted about earlier, to impact charging decisions. Second, I will ensure that we diversify the office to reflect Orange County's diversity. Third, I will work with the Sheriff's Department and the heads of all of our, I think, 26 different police agencies throughout Orange County to urge them and work with them to diversify law enforcement to reflect the great diversity we have here in Orange County. We've got to recognize that some communities in Orange County are over-policed. Working on our cash bail system to move to a safety-based system and community safety-based system instead will also go a long ways in racial disparities. Hard to answer this question in 1 minute, but those are a few thoughts off the top of my head.
Thank you. Mr. Jacobs.
I think I can think of 3 ways to deal with this. I think the first one is pretty obvious. It's having the diversity of personnel in the office, which I think they're moving towards. They really are. Blind charging, my understanding is that in the future, police reports are not going to indicate the race of the suspect unless it involves a hate crime or a fact having to do with race. So that's one other way. Another thing is there's a new racial act about racial statements being made. If racial statements that are similar to the ones that Mr. Spitzer made in the Bugs case having to do with a racial overtone, if they're made, those statements have to be reported to the defense on that case because they're considered to be exculpatory evidence. Hopefully there won't be too many incidents of that happening, but if it does, those things need to be reported and dealt with. And I think that the goal here is, and I think it has to be carried out by the deputies involved, is you need the prosecution to be colorblind. That's what that's what our aim is.
Thank you. Our next question goes first to Mr. Hardin. Mr. Hardin, are you open to expanding Orange County's young adult court to more youth? How would you expand the court, and would you include youth accused of violent crimes?
Yes, absolutely on all counts. I think the way that we expand it is by increasing funding for it, devoting more prosecutors to it, and ensuring that the bars to entry aren't artificial. In other words, that the right people can get into the right program. I am really committed to, as much as we possibly can, ending the prosecution of children as adults. There will be exceptions to that. when kids who are almost of age commit horrific crimes, of course. But we pay a steep price in this society for charging kids as adults. We may get to that later. It's a little much for 20 seconds remaining, but yes, I'm absolutely committed to doubling down on those programs and those courts.
Thank you. Mr. Jacobs.
I think just like the other programs, the discretionary programs, expanding youth court, of course, I believe is a really good concept. The question is, how is it going to be applied, and what kind of offenses will qualify? And I think the problem is there's some of juvenile offenses that will not qualify and would probably be prosecuted as adult cases. However, the more that we can expand and the more people who can successfully be enrolled in youth court will probably in the long run knock down our crime rates and could be a very important successful program.
Thank you. Mr. Chihawk.
Yeah, you're not going to hear much different from me. I mean, I agree. These programs are vitally important. We cannot incarcerate ourselves out of these types of problems, right? So to take a youth who is 16 and put them in prison, in adult prison for 10 years, all you end up with is a violent criminal when that person comes out at 26, right? You need to have a smarter criminal justice system that treats these cases on an individual basis. Now, I would be fully committed to ensuring that the presumption, the overwhelming majority of juveniles are tried as juveniles. But as the other two candidates said, there are crimes that are horrific enough that those individuals need to be prosecuted as adults. And so depending on what the definition of violent crime is, there are people who deserve to go to prison.
Thank you. Our next question goes first to Mr. Jacobs. Mr. Jacobs, what is your position on the death penalty? In what situation would you seek the death penalty?
Well, that's an interesting question. I believe in the death penalty. I believe that it's appropriate. There are safeguards to the application. When I was on the homicide unit for 13 years and supervised it for 3, whether or not to enforce, whether or not to seek the death penalty was an issue that came up on a case-by-case basis. And what I learned from my experience is you can't really have any rules or strict regulations or concepts. Each case is different. Each case has its own circumstances. So I guess my answer is I see the application as being carefully applied, and it should be done with a lot of discussion and a lot of weighing of the various facts, including the circumstances of the case, the background of the victim, and the probability that a jury would make that kind of a finding. But it's a very serious concept, and I believe it still has a place in our judicial system.
Thank you. Mr. Chihawk.
Yes, while I personally view the death penalty as appropriate in very rare circumstances, I recognize that in California, the death penalty is really a symbolic sentence. The entire process, particularly in California, is designed so the death penalty is not carried out. So one, even in the rare circumstances that I personally believe the death penalty would be appropriate, I would only pursue such a charge with the complete support of the family of the victims. It's not worth putting them through years of appeals, clemency hearings, and the entire process if at the end of the day, this is not a punishment that they feel is appropriate for them or that fits within their particular beliefs. At the end of the day, however, that penalty is something that I do not believe is worth taking off the table, even though I personally believe that in my lifetime, the death penalty will be outlawed.
Thank you. Mr. Hardin.
I will not seek the death penalty. For the worst offenders, I will seek life without parole. Look, few things garner media attention like tough talk about seeking the ultimate justice following some horrific crime. Todd Spitzer is a showman, and he has never wasted an opportunity to take advantage of that. But I think in the process, he re-victimizes survivors and betrays taxpayers. Prosecutors who seek the death penalty do so, they knowing full well it's a sentence that will never be carried out. California hasn't carried one out in 16 years. There's a moratorium that's unlikely to ever be lifted. There are tons of appeals that go on for decades that re-victimizes survivors who are forced to relive their trauma and deal with uncertain outcomes in their cases. It also is just wildly expensive. Since 1978, we spent $4 billion, even though it's never been shown to prevent crime. I'm a leader. I'm not a showman, and I refuse to re-victimize survivors and betray taxpayers for the sake of headlines and TV appearances.
Thank you. Our next question goes first to Mr. Chihawk. Mr. Chihawk, how will you swiftly, thoroughly, and transparently investigate officer-involved shootings or police brutality?
Yeah, so I think this is really about trust, right? There has to be public confidence in how this process works out. So the very first thing I would want to do is change how these cases are investigated. We cannot have departments investigating their own misconduct, right? So I would want to start a process where you had outside law enforcement investigating other departments. It's also important in the vast majority of these cases, there is a concurrent FBI civil rights use of force investigation that occurs. I would want to wait for the conclusion of both those investigations before making any charging decisions. But at the end of the day, what you really have to have is accountability in the process. If people don't have a belief that the process is fair, they're never going to accept what the ultimate decision of the district attorney is in charging that particular case. And so I would really want to be transparent in how I reach those decisions. And you wouldn't see the opinions in my office that were pushed out that were just simply a recitation of the best possible outcome for the officer.
Thank you. Mr. Hardin.
To directly answer your question, Jan, I will create an outside agency or a walled-off agency within the district attorney's office to review and prosecute, if necessary, prosecute these cases. Look, I think all of us here are tremendous supporters of law enforcement. We all know that they're by and large the heroes among us, and this is an incredibly difficult moment in our history to serve in law enforcement. But when we fail to hold police accountable, it has public safety implications for the whole community. When the public sees police officers get away with transgressions and not hold each other accountable, they become less trustful of law enforcement, less likely to report crime. That presents a danger to all of us, and it leaves taxpayers on the hook for massive payouts and lawsuits that take place against police agencies. I'll also mention here that Todd Spitzer is bought and paid for by the police agencies. He's expected hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of his career. I have committed to not taking a dime from law enforcement.
Thank you.
Unions.
Mr. Jacobs.
Yeah, well, presently there is a system in place in Orange County involving all police shootings, and except for Huntington Beach, and I know this because I've worked these cases, the district attorney has a rollout team for all police shootings. And that, I think, helps with the independent review. It doesn't solve all the problems, but at least you have independent review. As far as police brutality cases, that could be a problem. There is no independent review of police brutality cases. And I think what needs to be established is something similar to the Orange County approach to the police-involved shootings. And there needs to be an independent review in order for, I think, the community to feel that there was a fair and an impartial review of these cases. And right now, no such program is in place, and I think that should change.
Thank you. Our next question goes first to Mr. Hardin. Mr. Hardin, how much money has your campaign accepted from public safety unions and associations?
0.
Mr. Jacobs.
0.
Mr. Chihawk.
Yeah, I haven't accepted money from anybody.
Well, that was a quick question.
Yeah.
Next question first to Mr. Jacobs. Describe the performance standards that can be used to evaluate a district attorney.
Oh, okay. Could you repeat that? You don't mind?
Sure. Describe the performance standards that can be used to evaluate a district attorney.
Well, I think, well, there's a number. I think, first of all, the efficiency of the office, I think, and the number of cases that are handled versus the number of cases that are resolved, that shows how much work is being done. There's a conviction rate also, and conviction rate having to do with trials and conviction rate having to do with pleas. Other than that, that really the other standards, I think, are more having to do with staff. I think the question would be, is the composition of his staff, how what is the turnover of personnel? And I know right now in the district attorney's office, they've had a turnover of a 33% loss in 3 years, which means something is really wrong. Another standard would be how many lawsuits have been filed against the district attorney and his staff. And in my 30 years in the DA's office, I'm not aware of a single lawsuit that was filed, such as the ones that the 14 that have been filed against Mr. Spitzer involving enabling sexual harassment. So there seems to be a problem there.
I'm sorry, Miss. Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. Mr. Chihawk, you're next, please.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't believe there is a purely objective standard to say this district attorney is good and this district attorney is bad, right? What ultimately this question comes down to is, does the community trust the district attorney to do the right thing at the right time, right? That is an imperative question about most public officials. It is paramount for a district attorney. If you can't trust the district attorney to do the right thing at the right time, you're not going to have confidence in the justice system as a whole. The thing that has clearly been demonstrated by events in this county and this country is that when any part of the justice system suffers from a lack of public confidence, the entire process suffers. So while all those things are great, you can tell how many cases are prosecuted, how many cases are diverted, how many cases they sent to Veterans Court. At the end of the day, you want to take a look at who your district attorney is and say, can I trust that person to do the right thing at the right time?
Thank you. Mr. Hardin.
Thanks. Yeah, I think we've really got to change the dynamic that exists now by which prosecutors move through the office upwards through the office based on the number of trials and convictions that they get. We've got to reward prosecutors for achieving just results overall. And we've got to leverage the different strengths that people bring to bear. I've known some incredible prosecutors who are really great writers and researchers, but they don't do great standing up and selling a case in front of 12 people. I've met other prosecutors who are really well-spoken and smooth and can convey the facts and law of a case very well, but can't write and can't research. We've got to create spaces to leverage all the strengths that people have within the office and make sure we keep an eye on rewarding them for achieving results, for doing justice rather than just winning.
Thank you. Our next question for Mr. Chihawk. To what degree do you believe the district attorney can lower the crime rate in Orange County? What tools does the office have to do that?
So again, this is where I think something like diversion, alternate courts, that's really where it comes in to the district attorney's discretion. We can't keep cycling people through the justice system in the hopes that they do something different when we let them out. We have to be proactive in how we treat those individuals that come in. But again, to me, we are failing the community if we are waiting until people are introduced to the justice system to start taking these proactive steps. We need to be involved in mental health and drug addiction in a way that addresses these problems before they become an issue for the criminal justice system. At the end, the criminal justice system, I've used this analogy before, but is a sledgehammer, right? It is not the thing that is going to fix the ills that are facing society. We need to do better as society in treating vulnerable populations before they make their way into the justice system.
Thank you. Mr. Hardin.
The DA can do a tremendous amount about lowering the crime rate here. We are living through the Spitzer spike. On Spitzer's watch, crime and homelessness in Orange County has grown at significantly higher levels than it has in LA. And yet Spitzer wants to talk about a different county to distract from the failure that his administration has been. Look, here are 3 specific things we can do to address the rise in crime. The first is implementing an intelligence and data-driven prosecution approach. 5% of offenders commit 50% of crime. So we can use the intelligence resources at our fingertips to identify those individuals and go after them. Second, changing our approach to treating victims of crime. It's not just the right thing to do, it's a public safety approach, because guess what? Hurt people hurt people. And then finally, we've got to make identifying, apprehending violent offenders our priority. It is not right now. The top 10 most prosecuting cases in Orange County are all low-level, nonviolent cases. Happy to delve into each of these later in the breakout rooms.
Thank you. Mr. Jacobs.
I think, this is the age-old dispute or discussion that goes back for how do you lower crime rate? And unfortunately, the answer is not necessarily diversion programs or increased or decreasing sentencing or opening up the jails. That doesn't work, unfortunately. And I think we're going to see it happen. The only way you reduce the crime rate is you increase the enforcement of the law. And then that probably means more arrests, it means more sentencing and more people going to jail. And that's the only way that you reduce crime rate.
Thank you. Our next question is first to Mr. Hardin. Mr. Hardin, should we change some felonies to misdemeanors?
I'm not sure I understand the question correctly. It's the DA should not change the law. The district attorney is the executive, and the legislative branch creates the law. As district attorney, I will follow the law. There are certain crimes that can be charged as wobblers. They're called wobblers, meaning they can be charged as misdemeanors or felonies. And we've got to give prosecutors discretion and restore their professionalism to treat each case on its own merits.
Thank you. Mr. Jacobs.
Yeah, well, I think that's already been done. Proposition 47, I think, which was approved by the voters 2014, reduced a number of misdemeanor of theft and drug charges and changed them into misdemeanors. And the result of Prop 47, clearly, at least from what I've read, has been an increase in property and theft crimes, to the point that even Democrats in the legislature are trying to move to either amend or appeal Prop 47. So it could be that we've gone too far there already.
Thank you. Mr. Chihawk.
The short answer is no. I mean, at the end of the day, the causes and reasons why crime is committed is incredibly diverse. And we don't have enough time in this particular session to go into all the reasons. But sort of just changing the criminal code for the sake of either being a smarter criminal justice system or tough on crime or a progressive, that is not an important distinction. What we need to do is treat people differently who enter the justice system depending on what they did, right? Labeling their crime as a misdemeanor or a felony isn't particularly a relevant discussion unless you're talking about these diversion programs and eligibility for them. But I think the larger answer is no. I don't think we just need to change felonies to misdemeanors.
Thank you. Our next question goes first to Mr. Jacobs. It goes back over some ground that we've touched on before. When a homeless person is stopped on a warrant for failure to appear in court on a nonviolent crime, what will you do to ensure those persons are offered a diversion or homeless outreach program? And do you agree that taking these steps would reduce the number of persons who continue to cycle through Orange County jails?
Yeah, well, hopefully when the person's arrested, he's diverted immediately. Well, the reality is he'll probably spend a day or two in jail before he goes before the court. The only way you could speed that up is expediting or setting up a system where he could go immediately to a diversion program if it was determined that he was suitable for that. But other than that, there isn't much you can do. Just try to get him to the diversion program as quickly as possible. And hopefully that'll set him on a path to rehabilitation that just spending 5, 10, 16 days in jail will not accomplish.
Thank you. Mr. Chihawk.
Yeah, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. When a homeless person is stopped on a warrant for failure to appear in court on a nonviolent crime, What will you do to ensure those persons are offered a diversion or homeless outreach program? And do you agree that taking these steps would reduce the number of persons who continue to cycle through Orange County jails?
Yes. So the second part of the question is easy. Yes, I think the more we use and staff and appropriately sort of send people to these diversion programs, the better off the justice system as a whole. In that particular scenario, I would share Mike's hope that that individual was offered diversion the first time. But again, right, that person, depending on their cause of homelessness, right, there's let's say transitional homeless individuals that may have lost their job or for some particular reason are homeless. The vast majority of homeless individuals either suffer from mental illness or drug addiction. Until we treat those underlying causes, that person is simply just going to recycle through the program because that person will still be homeless, still be drug addicted, or still be impoverished when that person leaves whatever diversion program we're able to send him or her into.
Thank you. Mr. Hardin.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think we can create a diversion, so to speak, a diversion program at the point of contact. And we do that by allocating funding within law enforcement for crisis response teams that are staffed by professionals who are trained to interact with people experiencing homelessness or mental crisis or addiction, and who know and intimately understand all the resources at their disposal within Orange County to get these people the help they need. Because it doesn't make sense to just criminalize them over and over again. Incarcerating people who are experiencing homelessness gets them off the street for what, 24 hours, 48 hours a week, but they don't carry serious time. And as a result, people are released back into society without treatment and with a criminal conviction that makes it more difficult to find employment and housing. Creates a vicious cycle that we've got to work on. And the DA has a lot of power to do that.
Thank you. Our next question goes first to Mr. Chihawk. And it's going to take me a minute because I've got 4 questions here about care court. And we're not going to get to all of them. So I'm going to try and sort of put them together. There is a question about how care court can respond to the crisis of insufficient housing and treatment availability. But there's also a question about how care court can be designed in a way that will not reinforce systemic racial biases. And then there's the question of whether or not care court is a coercive whether it coercively forces treatment or whether it is better not to force treatment. Can you simply give us your feelings about care court, its effectiveness, and how it addresses these issues?
Yeah, so I mean, the difficulty here, right, is at the end of the day, by the time the person enters care court or any diversion program or any alternative to prison, we're already sort of behind the 8 ball, right? I firmly believe there is a part of our community that is incapable of helping themselves, right? Take methamphetamine, right? Today's methamphetamine, if you use this more than a few times, it fundamentally changes your brain chemistry, right? That person is drug addicted and homeless, maybe has mental issues beforehand. What we need to do is address these problems both within the justice system, but hopefully before we ever get there. So yes, I mean, as I sort of mentioned earlier, I think we need to revisit how we treat mental illness, drug addiction in this country, including things like civil commitment and conservatorship, to make sure that individuals get treatment who are unable to help themselves.
Thank you. Mr. Hardin.
Thank you. Yes, I'm in favor of care courts. I think our homelessness crisis, our mental illness crisis, our addiction crises are out of control. And I think care court is an effort to get at what I talked about in my opening, treating those issues as the public health crises that they are. I happened to be looking at the performance of care courts just the other day, and I was looking at my notes as you asked the question. The treatments in care courts led to a 29% decrease in homelessness, 107% increase in employment, and 65% reduction in arrests. It also led, by the way, to, I think it was over 30% reduction in emergency room visits. We've got to give this a shot, folks, and we need leaders who will speak out and be a strong voice for leadership in this area. And again, Todd Spitzer's failing in all aspects in this field.
Thank you. Mr. Jacobs.
I think it's really it's unquestionable that I think care court is a beneficial program. The problem is I think their resources may be somewhat limited. However, from what the returns are, as Pete pointed out, the returns are promising, and I think it's the kind of decision I think that it would be a mistake for someone who qualified for care court not to go there and see what benefits there are, because right now it's one of the more diverse programs available for homeless, and it has gotten positive results.
Thank you. Our next question goes first to Mr. Hardin. Mr. Hardin, do you think it is important to discuss with your colleagues the adverse immigration and collateral consequences when making policy and negotiation decisions in charging immigrants? And if you do, would you formalize those discussions?
It's not just important, Jan, it's the law. California requires prosecutors to take immigration consequences into account. We hear Todd Spitzer talk a lot about following the law, but he hasn't in this area. He has not stood up and been a leader here and talked to his prosecutors about this very issue. As I talked about earlier, we have to do everything we can to prevent punishing immigrants twice. Sometimes that's not possible. I understand that. But there are times when we can charge things in a way that they don't come with immigration consequences. Not just the right thing to do, it's a public safety imperative. We've got to make sure that our immigrant communities feel safe and welcome, so that they report crime, they participate in investigations, and testify at trials when necessary. That makes us all a lot safer.
Thank you. Mr. Jacobs. I think right now, and it's been that way for a while, I think prosecutors are responsible, and they're legally required to inform an illegal immigrant of what the consequences would be of any type of a plea that he enters. And it's one thing, on a number of occasions, I know it's happened where an immigrant will take a plea deal, not realizing that at the end of that, he's going to be deported immediately. So they need to know those consequences. And I think it's not that difficult to do, either on the filing stage or in the sentencing stage. It just, you have to be transparent about the consequences of the plea. And that's always been the law.
Thank you. Mr. Chihawk.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree. It is the law. It is actually a little more complicated than I think Mike would give it credit for. Immigration law is a tremendously complex web of federal, state laws, executive orders, executive policies, immigration policies that can change, right? And so to expect a district attorney to be both an expert in the criminal process and the immigration process is, in my view, unrealistic. We should do everything we can to inform individuals of the collateral consequences, whatever they are, of a plea agreement or their decision to plead guilty. But at the end of the day, we need to take accountability for what acts are done and what keeps the community safe. And so sometimes, and quite often, the collateral consequences of pleading guilty or deportation. And in my view, those are the right decisions made at that time.
Thank you. Our next question goes first to Mr. Jacobs. Mr. Jacobs, are you willing to hold police accountable for actions that target and single out the LGBTQ community and its leaders?
Well, yeah, that's a simple yes. As I said, when I worked in the district attorney's office, and my attitude is still the same, the law should be applied equally. And if there's unequal enforcement or if there's targeting of certain groups, then actions have to be taken to prevent that. And I would be very militant in proposing, putting that forward and letting the police departments know that's my position.
Thank you. Mr. Chihawk.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, right? It is fundamentally law enforcement and the justice system job to protect individuals, including vulnerable populations, right? You can't have a police force that decides this particular group is not worthy of its protection, right? So I would share Mike's sort of commitment to making sure that every single law enforcement officer in Orange County understood that that type of behavior was unacceptable and would result, if not criminal charges in them being removed from the police force.
Thank you. Mr. Harden.
I'm not sure I have much to add. The two gentlemen said it very well. I sort of go back to what I was saying about immigrant communities. Our LGBT community, LGBTQ plus community, plays an incredibly important role in our vibrant county, our state, and our country. We must make sure that they feel protected and welcome, so that they feel comfortable reporting crime. Again, not just because it's the right thing to do, but as a public safety imperative. I will hold law enforcement officers to the same standard I hold everybody else. If they commit a crime, doesn't matter whether your collar is blue or white, or whether you carry a badge or anything else. You should be held accountable.
Thank you. Our next question goes first to Mr. Chihawk. Mr. Chihawk, will you commit to increasing access to Veterans Court?
Yes, I mean, as we've discussed before, alternative courts, particularly Veterans Court, which has my understanding at least, a very high success rate, is fundamentally important in terms of making the justice system equal, fair, and transparent, right? We need to do a better job of making sure we just don't recycle people through the justice system. And particularly with our veterans and PTSD and drug addiction, we need to do something better for them in order to make sure that we're just not re-victimizing them all over again.
Thank you. Mr. Harden.
Yes, absolutely. I know what it feels like to transition back into normal society when you come back from war, and it can be really tough. I am very grateful that I had a lot of support around me to do that well, and peacefully and successfully. But I know a whole lot of people who struggled and continue to struggle. I will absolutely be a huge supporter of veterans courts, but I will say, when I was a prosecutor, I saw some veterans taking advantage of that system, and I will also ensure that doesn't happen. It's there for an incredibly important reason. It should be used by the right people who really need it.
Thank you. Mr. Jacobs.
Yeah, yes, I support the increasing access to the Veterans Court. It's one of the programs that has proven to be more successful than many of the others. Our military veterans, especially combat veterans who are returning home, aren't getting the help that they need. My understanding is they're not getting the help they need from the Veterans Administration, and anything that we can do to help them and improve the services of Veterans Court, I would firmly support.
Thank you. We have time for one, perhaps two more questions. This one goes first to Mr. Harden. What is your position on the civil gang injunctions in place in Orange County cities?
I think we need to take a close look at them. I look forward to working with law enforcement to really understand what the benefit is for them, because I've spoken with a lot of groups in disadvantaged communities throughout Orange County whose communities have been torn apart by them. All too often, I think they are subjectively imposed, and there are also questions about their constitutionality. California as a whole is moving away from gang injunctions, so I will take a very close look at them, and I am not opposed to ending all of them if I don't get an adequate explanation about how they benefit public safety.
Thank you. Mr. Jacobs. I think there's a mixed reaction to this, and from what I've been reading and hearing about that, there's some question about whether or not these have been overly used or abused in certain circumstances. So I think, in view of that, I think I have some reservations about these civil injunctions, and I would want to really look into the details before I sought them, because there is some evidence out there that they have been misused.
Thank you. Mr. Chihawk.
Yes, I would get rid of them as soon as possible. I don't think there's just evidence that they're misused. They are misused, right? This is not a productive program in order to keep the community safe. It is simply I am tough on crime and therefore I have this gang injunction. There are plenty of communities that are not, LA or San Francisco that have gotten rid of gang injunctions, including San Diego, which is not, a liberal mecca. And it's just the right thing to do. This is not something that is productive for law enforcement. And so I would get rid of it as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more before your closing, and it'll go first to Mr. Jacobs. What resources would you commit to the unsolved homicide cases in Orange County?
That's a great question. When I was working in the DA's office, I created the Unsolved Homicide project called Trackers, and it was remarkably successful. It got nationwide acclaim. Unfortunately, over time, it's fell into misuse. I mean, it's fell into total disuse. Under Mr. Spitzer, I believe it no longer exists. And one of the first things I would do if elected district attorney, I'd bring back that program. It not only helped solve unsolved, not only was successful dealing with unsolved cases, we also found an innocent man who had been convicted of one of the murders we were looking into. So it's a very worthwhile project, and I'd be very devoted to it.
Thank you. Mr. Chihawk.
Yeah, I agree. Really what we want to do is focus on crimes that are detrimental to the community. And you can't get much more detrimental than a murder. And so we need to be focused on law enforcement, on the district attorneys, on all aspects of the justice system about proactive policing in a way that makes the community safer. So having another 10,000 drug arrests isn't the thing that's going to make the community safer. However, solving unsolved murders is one that's going to do the community a lot of good.
Thank you. Mr. Harden.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Anyone who listens to the True Crime podcast knows the value of bringing a fresh set of eyes on an old case. I know that Mr. Jacobs has had a lot of experience in this area. It's absolutely a department within the office that we should put resources into.
Thank you. Going to move to our closing statements now, and we'll do that in reverse order from our opening statements. So the first person to give his closing statement this evening will be Mr. Chihawk.
Yes. First of all, thank you for everybody who attended today. And I really do think this is a valuable process that we're going through. In my opening sort of speech, I talked about trust. And it's interesting because the three candidates here, we all have different experiences. There's not one that's better than the other. There's not one that is, if you elect that person, you are 100% sure what you're going to get, right? What you know you're going to get is from Todd Spitzer, right? And that particular administration, at least from my standpoint, he has proven by any objective standard that he is unfit for that office. I think it's important to look at our three resumes and backgrounds and experience and decide for yourselves who you trust to serve the community in the best interest of the community. So who do you trust to keep the community safe while differentiating between those who deserve imprisonment and those that merit a different approach, right? When answering that question, I think it's just very important to understand who we are as individuals and who we are as candidates. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chihawk. Mr. Jacobs.
I think in summation here, I think what all three of us have been saying is that the job of district attorney isn't for amateurs or career politicians or people who are just learning about how to be a prosecutor. It's too important a job. It's too critical to our system. And I think that's the problem with the present district attorney. At the same time, we have a significant part of our population who has become enamored with this progressive equity woke policies of law enforcement. That it seems to me, as long as they don't become victims. The crime rate for all categories are rising in California and also in Orange County. In spite of being Mr. Spitzer's claim of being the great protector, criminals don't seem to fear him any more than they do in other counties. Recidivist rates are also rising. In a recent study of 30 states of over 400,000 prison inmates, over 44% were rearrested in their first year post-release. again, moving towards less incarceration, which has been the vogue here in California for a long time.
Mr. Jacobs, you need to bring to a
One
close.
sentence, and if you don't mind. Unfortunately, it looks like the pendulum is swinging back, and stricter sentencing, not less, may be what is needed to reduce the rising crime rate. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hardin.
Thanks. I want to talk about one of the most powerful meetings I've had over the last year. It was a few weeks ago with the Orange County chapter of Parents of Murdered Children. It's a support group for family and friends of kids who were killed by violence. Incredibly moving to hear their stories and hold space for their unspeakable grief. Listening to them, hearing about how our justice system operates from their perspective, I learned so much about the changes we need to make to support our community of victims and survivors. And unfortunately, I learned more about how our current district attorney is failing us. I met the mother of Victoria Barrios. I stepped out of the picture for a second to grab her pen, Justice for Victoria Barrios, which I keep on my board in my office. She told me that she's met Spitzer several times, tries to discuss her case with him, but that every time he sees her in public, he doesn't even recognize her and acknowledge her. And yet when Spitzer wants to fill a stage for a photo op or a story about how he fights for victims, he calls her every time. That's not leadership, that's showmanship. And that's all Spitzer has to offer us. The policies he has pursued are demonstrated to clearly increase recidivism and exacerbate homelessness. And unsurprisingly, crime and homelessness are both up under his watch.
Thank you, Mr. Hardin. Yeah, I'm sorry, but your time is up.
Oh, that's okay. I didn't realize my time was up so quickly. Thanks.
I want to, on behalf of the League of Women Voters of North Orange County, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. Thanks also to our timekeeper and technical staff for making tonight's forum possible. Links to the recording of this event will be available on the League of Women Voters Orange County YouTube channel. Give us a day or two to get that up. Our League website at LWVnoc.org will contain links to votersedge.org, where candidates for all offices that pertain to your ballot can submit information at no cost, as well as the link to the Easy Voter Guide. Most of all, we must thank our candidates for running and for participating in this forum. Without their willingness to serve, our democracy simply would not work. So thank you, gentlemen, very much. Good evening, and please remember to vote. Before we close, all of our candidates have agreed to meet with audience members who wish to speak with them in chat rooms after we have closed the forum, which we will do very, very shortly. Mr. Hardin will be in chat room 1, Mr. Jacobs in chat room 2, and Mr. Chihawk in chat room 3. The forum will be completely closed. The recording will be ended, and those of you who wish to